Welcome to this last talk. It'll be done by Simon Stewart. Something about Simon, he founded and is running tech companies and has been leading development teams for almost 15 years now. He's the founder of Broken Keyboard Software, which focuses on technology consulting and thought leadership. And he's also the organizer of the awesome JSNXO conference. And Simon will be talking to us about how we're learning the wrong things. Over to you, Simon.
All right, cool. Design? Yeah. All right, so like Yankee said, my name is Simon Stewart. So thank you very much for coming. I know it's the end of a two-day conference, which is always quite long and tiring. So I do appreciate you guys being here. So yeah, I do a couple of things, which we're not really going to have time to get into, including that, which is a bit awkward. I'll explain to someone later about that. So my issue is not Agile in general, just to kind of get that out there. My issue is I think that we've been fed too many books, and too many courses, and too many things that make it seem as though we can take what works for one company and one individual, or one group of individuals, and go and apply it to our problems. So my issue is, again, it's not the capital Agile, or it's not the lowercase Agile, it's the capital Agile, which is something Martin Cronier said yesterday. So the one thing I'm seeing a lot of in customers is they talk about rolling out Agile. Who's heard that phrase? So that's a really bad thing to do. To presume that you can, in a big bang, very sort of un-agile way, to go and roll out a whole methodology on an unsuspecting department or unsuspecting company. So we see that a whole bunch, and I'm seeing that in tech companies or tech teams as well, where they think the newest and best thing, which is kind of on this week or this year, is domain-driven design, and they think that anything can be solved with DDD. So they go on fancy courses and read fancy books, and they feel that that is going to be the thing to save their projects, which is very seldom going to be the case. So a little bit cynical, but it's coming from a good place. So in terms of some of the history, so I'm going to go through a bunch of slides just to show you that the things that we're talking about and have been talking about the last day and a half are nothing new. So the lesson that I want you to get out of this first part is to watch out for derivative works. So there are a whole bunch of books that come out, and the books have come out all the time, but a lot of them are based on things that I'm going to talk about over the next handful of slides. So I always find the best way to hack learning is, instead of reading all the derivative works, you go to the source, and you get information from that. So it's something that's worked pretty well for me. So the one is around Zen. So it sounds really weird to talk about Zen when you're talking about software. There's a very good book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. Has anyone read that? So it's a very good book to read. And the general principle of what they talk about is that Zen, in this case, is not something that you achieve. It's more something that you practice and you strive towards, which I think is something that we all should be learning in our department around Agile, that we can't actually finish Agile and actually be 100% Agile. We've got to do bits and pieces and just be better each time we actually go through an iteration. So the next one is a chap called William of Ockham. So he created this phrase or this idea called Occam's razor, which basically says if you're presented with multiple options, the simplest option is probably going to be the best one. And I often see teams failing to get that fundamental, that they feel that the more complex something is, the more likely it is to succeed. So I'm hoping that you guys are kind of see through that. So the next one, which is something that often is attributed to Apple and to some of the Apple designers, is this idea that perfection is not when you have nothing more to add, it's when you have nothing more to take away. And I think that's a pretty profound thing, not just in terms of design, but in terms of process as well. It's not about trying to add the new thing, it's trying to take away what you don't need and whittle it down just to the bare essentials. So there's quite a history around what happens from Toyota and the Americans after the Second World War, and what happened. There's a whole kind of story around that to do with the Toyota production system. But the one thing is around this thing that they call the Deming cycle or the Deming wheel. And that looks very, very similar to when you look at Scrum and iterations. So you go through some kind of iteration, you have some kind of retrospective, etc., and you go through that iteration over and over. That's exactly what you're seeing here. but this goes back kind of 60 years. So what you're looking at in things like Scrum, again, it's nothing new. It's really just honestly, I think it's some kind of derivative work based on a lot of these principles. So all this says is you plan to do something, you actually do it, you execute it, you check to see how that actually worked, and you act on that feedback. So for anyone that's done Scrum or read the literature, this is going to be nothing new to you. So the next one in terms of our kind of walk through the history is something called Kaizen. And Kaizen sounds like something really cool. It sounds like something that a consultant has to say to you a whole bunch of times and charge you for it. But the essence of what Kaizen is actually very, very simple, and that is improvement. So a change for the better. So not change for the sake of change, which is a bad thing. It's change for the better. So that is as simple as Kaizen is. Which leads us into the Toyota production system. So again, there's a whole lot of books and derivative works that have been done based on the Toyota production system. But the essence of what I'm going to be talking about, just to kind of cover it in a couple of slides, is this idea of eliminating waste. So it's as simple as that. It's looking at what you're doing in your organization or your work and seeing what is wasteful and what is not wasteful and what you can remove. It's really as basic as that. There's a bunch of principles that make up the Toyota production system, or the Toyota way. And again, there's a whole bunch of books you can read. But there are a couple of things just to point out. So Kanban is from this organization, it's from the way that they did things. After Kanzen, that Japanese phrase, which I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to pronounce, just means if you want to find good information, you've got to go to the source. So don't hypothesize about how something works, actually go to the proverbial shop floor and see how users are doing it, which feeds in very nicely from the previous talk. So the Toyota production system, like I said, is around eliminating waste. So one of the forms of waste is obviously overproduction. So we do that all the time as software developers. You sit down, you start writing chunks of code, and you don't really use the code, and you delete it, and that's wasteful. If you're doing it purely from an experimentation point of view and from a practice point of view, that's very different. But if you believe that it's being productive just to churn out code, I mean, that's not really working. The next part of what the Toyota production system talks about is unevenness. So how many people feel that they do the same amount of work as their colleagues? So unevenness is actually a big problem, and I'm seeing that break down some of the morale in a team when there's unevenness between what the team members are doing. The next one, the last part of the Toyota production system that I'm going to be talking about is this idea of things being too difficult. So often you'll find team members that are struggling to get to grips with certain things, and they're just hitting the brick wall. They just can't do anything because they view things as being impossible. And one of the important things about what Toyota did, which is something that I haven't found an organization locally that does it, is this idea of encouraging everyone to contribute to the way of improving. So this continuous improvement initiative that they have. So normally what happens, if you look at that top diagram, it's normally the senior people. They'll go and have a fancy offsite somewhere, they'll use everyone's Christmas bonus, and they'll come up with a couple of ways of improving, which for the most part they're not going to do. What should happen, and what doesn't happen, but what makes a whole lot of sense, is you get to the point that everyone in the organization is involved in constantly looking for ways to optimize and improve. This is from a book. I've got all the information in the slides. So the next one, just to kind of go through again from a history point of view, this is from the mid-70s. It's a very famous computer scientist called Dijkstra, which I hope I pronounced correctly, which I doubt I have. So he said a couple of interesting things. The last one was quite funny, although it's not really applicable to this talk, but I thought I'd put it in. The middle one, I think, is really important. So simplicity is a prerequisite for reliability. So often, teams try to make things complex. They feel if things aren't complex, they're not going to work, and they have to have a whole lot of moving parts. Whether it's actual code and development work, or it's process, they feel that if things aren't simple, then they're not going to work. Which, if you look at what he said in the mid-70s, it's very contrary to that. The top one, I think, is very important as well. As computer scientists, as people that generate software, you often feel that the software itself is the goal, and that often is not the case. And again, what the previous speaker spoke about as well, about being too attached to the work. Often if you're too attached to the work, you don't want anyone to criticize it, so you end up not showing it to anyone, and that just creates a very bad cycle. So that ends up with something that happened in the mid-80s. So in the mid-80s, two Japanese industrial psychologists came up with this idea that they put together in a paper for the Harvard Business Review. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides just to kind of walk through things. And the analogy they use is, instead of looking at something like a relay race, so as a process, instead of looking at it as a relay race where everyone finishes something and they pass it to someone else and that person continues for a bit and passes it on, instead of doing that, they should rather view it as a rugby game. So you can see how this is very much the origin of Scrum. So instead of relay race, look at it as a rugby match, which is exactly what they were talking about. So the article was called the New Product Development Game. And here are a couple of points that come straight out of the article. And again, I've got links to the article. So I specifically quoted everything just so it doesn't look like I've tried to put creative license to make it seem more Scrum than it actually is. And if you go through those things, you'll see how much they actually relate to what we've learned today as being Scrum. So this diagram on the right-hand side talks about how the top section is very much a waterfall approach, where certain teams and individuals finish their work and pass it to the next person. Then you get a slight bit of overlap, and then you get a much more iterative, much more overlapping kind of cross-functional way of doing something, which is, again, what we try to do. Just to look at some of those points, so self-organizing teams, so who recognizes that phrase? I think we've used it a whole bunch of times today. And things like cross-fertilization of skills, and also looking at hand-picked teams as well. So that's something that comes up, which I'm going to cover in a few minutes. And just to kind of cover a few more things from that same article. So they talk about a subtle control. So they don't talk about a command and control where the managers dictate exactly what needs to be done. Because you often find if that happens, the team itself is not going to function. They're just going to sit waiting for instructions, which is not what we should be doing as information workers. So they talk about having a subtle control. So the management must be there to create the problem and create the opportunity and allow the team to actually ignite and get things done. The third last point around the transfer of knowledge is something that I'm not seeing teams do very well. I think we've all got examples of having fancy intranets that we get set up because everyone's going to collaborate and it's going to solve all the problems. And then a month into it, the only thing on the intranet is like a birthday calendar and like that's about it. So it's very, very important, this whole transfer of knowledge. So here's an interesting phrase, Takichi, which I probably haven't pronounced, is one of the guys involved in that new product development game article. And this is a quote from a blog post. So it's just saying success was always due to cross-functional teams working intensely together to generate continuous improvement. And the author of that blog post is Jeff Sutherland, who's one of the founders of Scrum as a packaged unit of all this knowledge. And just to show you how closely this relates to Scrum, here's a really bad screenshot of the PDF. And the circle section at the bottom actually used the word Scrum. So, you can kind of see where a lot of this information came from. Which is not a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing that there's derivative works, but I am saying that it makes sense to go to the source of the information, so you don't have to worry about all the different kind of factions in the community and who do you follow this week, and it gets really confusing. So it's always a good idea to go to the source. The next one I'm going to be talking about is an article that was written by Eric Raymond called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. Has anyone read it? Okay, no one? It's a really cool thing to read. So I really recommend that you go and Google it and you go and find it. There's a couple of interesting points that he brings up. It's a very easy reading article, or like a small book, I guess. And throughout the book, he specifies these rules that he's discovered. So just a couple of them that make sense. So treating your users as co-developers, that's something we don't do. So often we treat users either as an enemy, which I'm seeing a lot of, or we treat users as someone that you interact with towards the end of a cycle when you want to go through some kind of UAT so you can get paid. So it's like a tax, which is a pain. But if you treat them as co-developers, I think that hopefully ends up in a much better space. Sure, and that last one just is around motivation. So if you have a problem that actually interests you, you're probably going to get a lot more engaged in it. And I'll cover that in a few slides. So we've heard about Fred Brooks a few times. So the whole Mythical Man Month, for those that haven't read, I really would recommend that you read it. He did another book, or an article called the No Silver Bullet. And it's included in some of the newer editions of his book. But the No Silver Bullet article has a couple of really interesting points that I think we must have a look at. And bear in mind, this goes back a fair amount of time. This is not a new thing. So build versus buy. So we all heard that. So we all live by that. So I'm a software developer. I get paid to write code, not to buy products. So that's a joke. Not really. And that middle point again is around enthusiasm and motivation. So enthusiasm jumps when there is a running system, even a simple one. And that speaks to things like continuous integration and continuous deployment. So it's always nicer to be in charge of a system that's actually running and users are using it. It creates a nice sense of urgency. So a couple of issues that I'm seeing. And this is not kind of just my opinion, it's on Google as well, is this idea of disengagement. So I actually Googled the word disengagement, and the fourth one, so bottom left-hand corner, is an article about if you disengage at work, this is what to do. So that's kind of how scary it is. Amongst all the dictionary definitions, there's one on Forbes about how disengaged everyone is. And I'm seeing that a lot in stand-ups even. I'm seeing a lot of teams that are disengaged that will get into work, they'll wait for the stand-up because it's their instruction of what to do, and then they'll kind of get some instruction and they'll sit down and they'll do it. And that to me is a very, very bad place to be. So has anyone else picked up that issue? Where people actually wait for instruction at a stand-up and they're not engaged? Couple. So one of the issues that I'm seeing as well is around pigeonholing people. So we all want to have job titles, I guess. I've got my own company, so it doesn't actually mean anything because I can just get the business card printed. There's no like barrier there. But if you give people a specific job title or specific responsibilities, you tend to find that they'll only do that. So we've got a team at the moment that I'm working with that we have specialized testers, and those testers want to do development, and the developers don't want to do testing because there's a tester. So the tester's going to do the testing, which kind of makes sense in one respect, but it blows out this whole idea of cross-functional. So you're pigeonholing people a little bit. And in my opinion, people want pay and progression. They don't necessarily just want job titles. I've joined more than one company in the past where there was a fancy job title because there wasn't good pay, and that doesn't really mean a whole lot. So it kind of meant a fair amount at the time, but not really kind of when you think back on it. There's a really good TED talk by Daniel Pink that I recommend you guys have a look at. And he talks about 3 things that motivate people. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose as the 3 things that motivate people. So autonomy, because you can make up your own decisions and you can move forward on your own. Mastery, because you can get better at something, which is something we all want. And purpose, which I think is something that a lot of companies and teams are failing to actually deliver, is to give their team members a purpose, an actual reason why they're doing something. So I was going to talk about the whole Agile consultancy and how I don't know if it really works, but I think the reason why I don't think there are areas where it doesn't actually work is because I think a lot of consultants are not there in a long-term fashion. They come in one day every couple of weeks or one day a month or kind of a once-off session, and they presume that that's going to help the team and the team's going to move forward. So the analogy is with Gordon Ramsay because his Kitchen Nightmares series has been cancelled because they realized that over 60% of the restaurants that he visited actually went back shortly after he visited them. And it's not because he doesn't know what he's doing or because his advice is not good. It's maybe because he's not there to mentor and to continue helping them kind of through the journey. And maybe it's also that his ideas are not going to work in that specific context. And I see that a fair amount, and it's difficult not to buy into the Kool-Aid a little bit when you read the books about how easy something is if you go through certain Scrum artifacts and Scrum meetings and that sort of thing, and the whole team's going to snap into place and everything's going to be great. It's not necessarily taking into account your specific requirements and your specific constraints as well. So around certification, my intention here is not to try and debunk everything, but I do think the one issue with certification is that it implies that if you can regurgitate the knowledge during a test, then you tick the box and you can go out and you can solve all the problems, which is really not helping anyone. So I'm not a fan of certification. Just kind of random. So just before we get into some of the possible solutions, the one thing I want to stress to you is most people are not going to do anything. It's not even cynical. It's just reality. So most people won't. Most people won't go out and read books. Most people won't go out and improve themselves. And I must be honest, I don't think most people will go from a conference like this back to their office and try and incrementally improve things. So I'm hoping you guys are different. But I think in general, that is the general thing. And I think it's time that we, as an organization or as an industry, we stop making excuses and we actually start be more productive and actually start making things. So in terms of possible solutions, and again, this is very much from my experience, some things that have worked, some things that haven't worked, some things that I'm continuing to try and make work. So just a couple of possible solutions. So the one quote from a chap called Yvan Chouinard, which apparently is how you pronounce it, I had help. He runs a company called Patagonia. So it's like a Cape Union kind of thing, it's not the country. And he says maintaining a sense of urgency throughout a company is one of the most difficult challenges in business. And it's something that I see every single day. So I've been communicating with the team during the day to try and make sure that they're actually doing work, but I'm not there. And there's just no sense of urgency, which is quite a pain. But it's quite a common thing where people just feel that tomorrow's another day and everything's cool, and there's no real kind of fire to get things done. There's a big difference between urgency and crisis. But I think urgency is something that you can do the whole time. There was another quote, albeit off Twitter, which kind of said the same sort of thing. And this is something that I've been telling teams ever since it came out. So lack of urgency, unfortunately, seems to be the most common company killer outside of the Valley. So the Valley, obviously Silicon Valley. So there needs to be a sense of urgency. So one possible approach is to view your levels of developers. Instead of presuming that your junior developer can get away with not really doing anything very well, presume that the junior developer knows a handful of things very well and has to do them very well. Your intermediate developer needs to know several things very well and complete them to that effect. And your senior developers need to know a whole bunch of things and do those really well. Too often I'm seeing the kind of lower end of the development spectrum getting away with not doing anything. And I don't think that's helping anyone. So the one test that you can do to see if your team is agile is to disappear for a month and come back and see if it is fundamentally different. See if it's improved. See if there's any difference between the time that you left and the time that you came back. You're not expecting a complete kind of turnaround, but see if it is incrementally different. One of the approaches which comes from Reid Hoffman's book, who's the founder of LinkedIn, is this idea of tours of duty. So a tour of duty is presuming that someone's not going to be at your company for their entire life. You're not going to be there forever and get your gold Rolex and have a whole retirement. That doesn't really happen anymore. But try and break up the career into tours of duty. There's a really good book which I'll show you at the end, which I recommend you guys have a look at. So Anthony Casalina, who's the founder of Squarespace, said something in an interview the other day, which I think is very good. And it's something that we haven't really spoken about at this conference. And that is getting the right people in the room. There's no point trying to have self-organizing teams that you think are just magically going to, form amongst themselves and everything's going to be great if you don't have the right people in the room. And that is a fundamental thing that I don't think we get right. So Netflix, so Reed Hastings speaks about the company being a sports team and not a family. And one of the reasons it's a sports team and not a family is at some point you're going to have to tell someone to leave. And you can't really do that in a family. Maybe kind of in-laws and that, but certainly not immediate family. So his test is which of my people, if they told me they were leaving, would I fight hard to keep? My presumption from a lot of the companies that I've worked with is that's probably going to be maybe 20%. So it shouldn't be 20%, that's a really bad thing. Jack Dorsey, who's the founder of a whole bunch of things, says that you need to continually be editing your team. And it sounds a bit rough to say that, but the reality is you've got to do that. You've got to start pruning your team. Certain people have to come and go. That's just how it is. And it maybe doesn't fit within the mandate of an Agile consultant, but it's one of the fundamental failings of a lot of teams, where you allow people who are not productive in the team, and it actually just draws the energy and the motivation out of a team. So you need to make sure you get to a point where you can start editing your team. And it sounds crude to say that, and this is maybe more of an HR thing, like I said, but again, I'm seeing that as the fundamental failure of a lot of teams, where they will not perform because there's too much dead weight. So a couple of ideas of what you can do. So the one is to make sure that you're encouraging experimentation. And workshops like the Code Retreat, which is happening tomorrow, is a great example of that, where you give people a safety net and they can actually create something through a sort of 45-minute session, and they delete it because it's purely around practice. So the other one is not betting on one specific thing. You're not going to open up the Agile toolkit, if there's such a thing, there probably is, and take out all the bits and pieces and fit it into your environment and everything's set. I work with teams that do stand-ups that are failing completely. I work with teams that don't do stand-ups and are doing phenomenally well. So for me, there's no correlation between the kind of methodology they're using and their actual productivity. I think the one common factor is the quality of the individual. Sharing information is very important, as well as pursuing meaning and purpose. So I've got 3 more slides. So a couple of productivity ideas. And again, this is a whole kind of session on its own. The one is making sure that you reward laziness, which sounds really weird, because we're brought up not to be lazy. Look busy so you keep your job. That's kind of the fundamentals. But if you reward laziness, you allow people to find shortcuts, which for the most part, if you've got good people, is going to end in a good place. So they're not going to cut corners in terms of quantity, they're going to cut corners in terms of what am I doing the same every day that I can actually automate. The Pomodoro technique, is anyone using the Pomodoro technique? So it's an idea of breaking up the day into 20 or 25-minute sessions where you almost have a sprint and you focus 100% on one task. It's a very difficult thing to do, but I'm finding a lot of teams getting a lot of benefit out of it. The next one is minimizing the keyboard time, which kind of follows in from that top one. And it's the idea of trying to get your developers to start the day by not firing off email and typing some nonsense so it looks like they're busy. To rather spend the first 45 minutes, whatever the chunk of time is, to actually give thought to why they're there and what they're actually going to accomplish for the day. So the third last slide is around this 1%. So my opinion is if you want to be in the top 1%, all you need to do is make sure that you're continually improving 1% every day. It's about as simple as that. It's not about trying to have a big bang approach and going back to the office and changing everything and trying to get a 50% increase, because that's not going to work. People are going to notice it. You need to be like that lobster in the boiling water, where you just change certain things just to make things slightly better, slightly more efficient. So it's just that 1% efficiency that you're increasing every single day or every single week or every single iteration. The one thing you don't want to do is try and jump the gun and do a 50% at a time. So don't try and do rollouts, just try and do that very, very small increment. So there are a couple of books that I recommend just before we end off. Again, I'll distribute the slides, I'm sure, via Barry and them, so you guys will get them. But these 6 books I think are very important to read. None of them are like really thick books, so they're pretty easy to go through. But I really do recommend that you go through them. This bottom right one is the one that talks about this tours of duty. So it's a very good one to read. It's just come out recently. All right, so that's me. That's my dog. So please follow Bad Lassie on Twitter. Are there any questions? Okay, cool. All right, thank you very much.